I'm going to introduce our speaker with some restraint. It is a matter of detente because I can destroy him, but he has the power to destroy me as well because we are very, very good friends. I didn't know Greg DeLoach when he was living on the farm in Eatonton, Georgia. I didn't know him when he took his pastorate in Chickamauga, Georgia, just near Chattanooga. But when, as a very young minister, early mid-30s, when he went to be pastor of First Baptist Marietta, Georgia, I knew this guy's got game, because a guy that young taking on a church of that significance has obviously got a lot of skill. We got to know each other when he was pastor of that church. We got to know each other much better when he moved to be pastor of First Baptist Church Augusta. 10 years? 10 years right at that he was pastor of that significant church in our state. And some of you might know that Greg and another friend of ours, Sean King, who's pastor of Johns Creek Baptist Church, during that time we would take weeks occasionally to go write, study, plan together. And as a part of that process, I just came to have just boundless respect for Greg's ministry, his skills. And so when he came later to be dean of the School of Theology at McAfee, where I had invested 18 years of my life, it felt like my children got a good stepfather. You know, I mean, that the place I had invested and loved for so long had somebody with his heart for the church and his love of theological education. So it's a privilege to have him across the Wednesday nights that I'm away, 5 Wednesday nights teaching Ecclesiastes, and I welcome you and thank you.
Thank you. All right. Hey, I have never been introduced as my children's stepfather or whatever. So I'm gonna mull that over on the way home. And I know some of y'all, I heard a collective gasp when he said 6 weeks in Ecclesiastes. I felt 5 was really stretching it. In fact, Doc was trying to talk me out of it. You sure you want to do 5 weeks on Ecclesiastes? And I said, absolutely. But I'll make a deal with you. If at week 3 it's going nowhere, you can pull me aside and say, listen, can we do the Gospel of John or Luke or something? It's fine. It's fine. But I do appreciate this book, and we'll talk about it in just a quick moment. Let me just simply extend my gratitude for the privilege of being with you all, and I mean that with great sincerity. Kept up with Second-Ponce just through the years, through the pastors that have blessed this congregation. Certainly when I was at First Baptist Marietta, we had various overlaps. Remember Mrs. Eubanks? I suppose that's all I need to say. Her son, Gary, was a member at First Baptist Marietta. And at the time, I was serving on the Board of Trustees at Shorter. Miss Hazel Eubanks was serving on the Board of Trustees at Shorter. And Gary's, and I can talk about this because they have all gone to be with their great reward. So the only reason I'm telling this story is that sadly, both are no longer with us. But Gary called me and said, Greg, can you take Mama to the trustee meeting? And I said, well, Gary, that'll be fine. I'll pick her up at such and such time in my car. And he says, no, Mama's going to want you to drive her Cadillac. So would you just, so I would drive Miss Hazel. It was kind of like driving Miss Daisy. You know, I was driving Miss Hazel to our trustee meetings. But I certainly got to know a lot about Second-Ponce. Through the eyes and opinions of Miss Hazel Eubanks. But I will tell you this, she loved this church, and this church is filled with members down through the generations that have loved and been a part of it. I know that you're part of that as well. All right, so what we're going to do, and thank you, Doc, more seriously, thank you for the introduction. Doc is not exaggerating. We've enjoyed a friendship for spanning several decades, and that's meant a lot to me. It's been life-giving to have someone to share with, and we do best practices. You know, we're not just friends, but we'll talk about what's going on in church life and how we can learn and grow from that. Many times I'll call him about things at McAfee and just say, you know, I don't really quite understand this culture, and can you help me interpret what may be at play here? So we all know it's important to have friends and colleagues that share common love and a common devotion and a common calling. And as long as I'm passing out gratitude, thank you all for your continued and faithful support of McAfee School of Theology. I'm sincere when I say we could not do it without you. We need churches like Second-Ponce, and Second-Ponce is a lead congregation in that regard. So we're able to do the mission of preparing ministers who will inspire the church and the world, and that's what we need. We need well-equipped ministers who will impact this world. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to look at the book of Ecclesiastes, and let's just kind of set this up here by a reading of a few short verses. Well, let's keep it on that title page there for just a moment, because I've given the title Curmudgeon, Crank, or Sage, and we'll talk about why I give kind of a bizarre title to that. In Ecclesiastes, we tend to think of it, if we think about it at all, with those simple verses in the opening chapter 3. And that's the great poetic passage. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. And then it unfolds with this beautiful poetic flourishing. For there is a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. And so the flow goes. I hope to get to that portion next week, so I won't digress into diagnosing a little bit about that particular passage. But we've heard that read often. We know it from funerals particularly, but perhaps at other occasions as well. We may even have it, cross-stitched or immortalized in some piece of artwork in our house here. But maybe the other way we know Ecclesiastes, and if we could advance to the next slide here, is the opening verses of the first chapter. So I'll just read them to you and we'll get started. So this is the words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And he starts off with a bang. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What do people gain from all their toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hurries to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes round to the north, and I could go on and on and on. You get the point, right? Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. And that's a repetitive theme that I'll unpack in just a moment that we hear throughout Ecclesiastes. And so some look at Ecclesiastes as, all right, I've read it once, I'm not going to read it again. It's awfully depressing, some might say. It can sound like as a dark, brooding book written by an old man bitterly reflecting over his life. And what's interesting in lectionary readings, and Doc, I know that you follow the lectionary a good bit, not always, but you follow the lectionary. In the lectionary selections, Ecclesiastes is given very little attention. So it's almost like this collective agreement. Yeah, this is a book that we'd rather not spend too much time in. I mean, we don't want people crawling out of the sanctuary here. Chuck Swindoll, y'all may remember that name from ages past, he interprets, the author of Ecclesiastes, that basically this is a book of someone who gets it all wrong. And so we have the book to show us, in essence, not how to live or reflect on one's life, but rather is a book that is teaching us how not to live life. Now that's one side of it. In fact, in canon history, Ecclesiastes was one of the books that was heavily debated, should it be included in the Bible? So somewhere around the 4th century, there was a great deal of conversation around this book because of its contents. Now there's another line of scholarship, and it's going to be the line that I fall on, that looks at Ecclesiastes as something like realistic optimism, which I like. That's a good turn of phrase. So earlier today, one of our Old Testament professors, Dr. David Garber, he was by the office, and we were just kind of having a casual conversation. I said, "Hey, David, by the way, I'm going to be teaching on Ecclesiastes tonight. What do you think about the book of Ecclesiastes? And he said, which I thought was interesting, he said, you know, when I was a young college student kind of getting ready to go on to seminary and ultimately to do PhD work in the Old Testament, he said, for me, I loved Ecclesiastes. And I thought, oh, that's great. He likes the book too. He said, I loved Ecclesiastes because I was cynical. And finally, I had a book that was just as cynical as me. But what's interesting is that he also continued to love Ecclesiastes, but for very different reasons. He said, I've been reading Ecclesiastes all wrong. This isn't a cynical book, but rather it is a book that grounds optimism. Not an ethereal idealism, but a grounded sense of what is life all about. So I'm going to pause here, and I don't know if we normally have dialogue. I know that we're streaming this, so I'll do my best to state the questions or state the observations, but I'm just curious, do any of y'all have thoughts about Ecclesiastes? And there's no wrong answer, not today. It'll be a wrong answer next week, but not today. Thoughts about Ecclesiastes? Do you like it? Is it a book you avoid? Is it something that means something to you? A room full of no opinion. Guarded opinion. Let me put it that way. Y'all are just waiting. All right. Well, I want you to be thinking in these weeks ahead, because we're going to look at some texts here that verses within this text that, well, they're going to require some explaining, and you may not agree with how it can be interpreted. You may have a different interpretation. So I hope we can kind of roll our biblical sleeves up and dive into this here. So let's go to the next slide here. So Ecclesiastes deals with life's big questions. And this is no exaggeration. This is no interpretation on my part. If you read this book, it's clear that at least 4 of life's big questions come up. The first question being, why am I here? You know, question of existentialism. And hopefully, at some point, we ask this question. Now, we think of it as a young person's question, and that's true. I think when a person becomes of age, they begin to ask that question. Well, you know, kind of, why am I here? What's my purpose? We deal with that at the School of Theology in very specific ways. I mean, we're assuming that a student that comes to study to prepare for ministry is responding on some level to a calling of God. Why am I here? And so they are discerning through studies to unpack that a bit. The second question is, what is the meaning of life? Now, I know these are big questions, but they're good questions, aren't they? Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? Currently, I'm reading a book called "The Edge of Life," or I think I've got the title right. "On the Edge of Life." It's a science book, and it's really dealing with, you know, how do we define life? And so you're kind of getting in the minutia of, do we define life and death by brain activity, by cardiovascular, the pumping of the heart? Do we define life by utilitarian definitions? You know, when you're useful, you're alive, and when you cease to be useful, well, you're as good as dead. But it's really much deeper than that about what does it mean to actually be alive. Thirdly, how can life best be lived? All right. And then finally, will my life be significant? Now, friends, those 4 questions are timeless. I don't care if you're 14 years old and you're filled with all that teenage angst and you hate everybody, especially your parents. Or I don't care if you're 85 years old and you're thinking, I don't even know if I have the energy to go to church tonight. For all of us, these 4 questions are significant lifelong questions. And I'll add, I think we answer them differently along life stages. Am I off on this one? I mean, the why am I here question, how we answered it as a 20-year-old may feel a little bit different when we're 30 years old. I keep making references to McAfee, but that's my context right now. It's interesting, and Doc was there 18 years, and I think he can agree. It's sometimes charming to have a 25-year-old student in the classroom that's full of optimism, full of idealism, full of righteous indignation, full of I'm going to change this world on its axis. We've all seen that. Hopefully we have been that. And we sat back and go, well, yeah, wait until life actually happens to you, right? And it does. I was on the phone, on a Zoom call today with one of our graduates, Darian Waite. I think you know him, Doc. He's one of the ministers at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And, oh, that's right, Chelsea Waite worked here. So Chelsea's husband. And everybody's in Chelsea's shadow. so we had Darian on a Zoom call, and we had a series of questions we were wanting to talk to our alumni about. And we asked him what were the courses that helped him the most in congregational ministry. And he said everything Karen Massey taught. And Karen Massey teaches in practical ministry. She teaches kind of the how-to. Now, when you're a student, those are sometimes, Doc, the least interesting classes. And he's discovering these become the most relevant classes. So I'm digressing a little bit here to simply illustrate that we're always wrestling with these four questions. Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? How can life, and put yourself in this, how can my life be best lived? And will my life be significant? No matter where you are in your age, these are the things that we can contend with. Now, I've already shown you my hand. I'm in the camp that not only am I glad that Ecclesiastes is in our Bible, I'm of the conviction that it should be preached and taught from on a regular basis. It's a book that we should know and we should seek understanding from. It's a book that will cause us to wrestle. I mean, I've read through it multiple times, and I'm always dealing with these passages in ways it's like, gosh, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know how to reconcile this. I don't know where the theological congruency is in this. So it's okay, but when you're asking these big questions in life, Ecclesiastes is not so much giving you the answer, but a way to walk through them, which actually I contend is the purpose of Scripture in general. It's not an owner's manual that you bring out of your glove box and say, okay, I've reached this problem. Let's see where I can find an answer. And if we don't like that answer, we just go to another book and another verse and find the answer that maybe fits our preconceived notion. But Ecclesiastes, like so much of the Bible, gives us the language to walk through life's experiences. So these wise sayings guide us in how to say no and how to say yes in life. Now, one of my mistakes as a pastor was that I probably didn't articulate it this way, but it's functionally how I lived as a pastor, and that is to overfunction. I felt like that if I wanted to be a good pastor, and if I wanted to be loved as a pastor and respected as a pastor and so forth, I had to say yes to everything. And I'm going to tell you, that will kill you. But not just as a pastor. I don't care what you're doing. And I don't want Doc to come back and he no longer has volunteers either. But for the servants of the church, I mean, I respect church members that when I ask if they can do something and they literally prayerfully think about it, and if the answer is no, well, that may be disappointing and it may give me more work to do. But I'd rather have a thoughtful no than an unreflected yes. Because then you just burn people out, and you're not answering what is their life's calling as it fits into that. One more thing before we continue to unpack some more. Ecclesiastes is read among our Jewish friends during the Feast of Tabernacles, and this is when you're celebrating both the bounty of harvest and the blessing of manna. And so it's interesting that our Jewish friends read Ecclesiastes annually in times of abundance and celebration. So they look at Ecclesiastes. So why do you think that is? This is a book that can be accused of being a bit cynical. It says that everything is vanity. Everything you've worked for is vain. Everything you love is vain. everything that you thought was going to be significant, all of that's vain. For everything there's a season under heaven, which means things come and things go. And yet our Jewish friends hold this up as an important reading during times of bounty and celebration. Why do you think that is? What's your thought? There's not a wrong answer. I just want to hear how you...
It puts the whole thing back into perspective. If everything is going great, wonderful, let's celebrate that. But let's also realize that that's not always how things are.
Puts things in perspective. No, keep going. I don't want to interrupt you. My memory was only going to last that far, so I had to jump in. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it puts things in perspective. So when things are going well and we're soaring on eagle's wings, as in the book of Isaiah, fine. But recognize things have a nature to them, right? Other thoughts? Why would you read Ecclesiastes in times of bounty and harvest and celebration? What would your thoughts be? That's a great response. The Jewish people have been on both sides of the fence. They have the memory of what it means to be enslaved by the Pharaoh, right? And they know what freedom tastes like, right? And they know that both enslavement and freedom come and go, and it's generational, right? So it's tied into something very, very deep for us. It's kind of interesting. I remember John Claypool tells the story I can't remember if it's in Tracts of a Fellow Struggler or one of his other books. Doc will know because he worked with John Claypool. I don't have that bragging right, but he tells a story about getting during World War II, and so much was rationed and people had very little. And one of the neighbors, and I don't remember why, but loaned John Claypool's family a washing machine. And Claypool's job as a little boy was to help wash the clothes. And so that loan of a washing machine was this wonderful gift. Oh my goodness, this is going to help us wash clothes. And so during the war, they had a washing machine to wash clothes. Well, the war ended, and for whatever reason, this family came to retrieve the washing machine, right? And John Claypool writes or preaches about how bitter he was in the loss of this washing machine. And his mother sat him down and says, "You are angry for what was loaned to us and was never ours in the first place. Instead, you should be thankful that we had this. We were able to have it during this time, this season." Now, I'm butchering a Claypool story, but you get the point. Life is like that. We have things that give us cause to rejoice and celebrate. But we also know that we will also walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And by the way, Hebrew scripture is filled with these kind of reminders. It's not a health and wealth gospel in Ecclesiastes. It acknowledges that we walk through this together. Good. Any other thoughts before we keep moving? All right, so for tonight, I'm just going to kind of set up some building blocks. And then in the weeks ahead, what we're going to do is then go through sections until we complete the entire book on that. So tonight is kind of giving us the structure, and then in the weeks ahead, we'll look at it more from chapter to chapter. So the first thing I'd like to invite you to do, if you dare to come back next week, and I'd like you to do it whether you're going to be back here next week or not, read through Ecclesiastes. I'm giving you 1 week's notice. Read through it. It's 12 chapters. It's not going to take long. We can't do a Bible study if you've not read the book in the Bible that we're looking at. I would also like to kind of challenge you one step further. Read through Ecclesiastes, if you can, in one sitting. I think it'll take about 20 to 30 minutes, but read through it. Because actually much of the Bible is intended to be heard in one sitting. I know we don't have that kind of attention span these days. I recognize that. I have monitors in my house on my phone and the iPad. Sometimes when we watch TV, we got 3 screens going at the same time. I recognize we're not used to sitting through something in a sustained way. But when you read through Ecclesiastes, there is when you begin to pick up the rhythm and the flow and the pattern. Because otherwise we are in danger of looking at a verse and just getting stopped in our tracks and thinking, oh, I don't know what is meant by this. And we try to dissect it. And in dissecting verses, even small passages, we're in danger of losing the music. So it's best to hear this as a whole and then come back and we'll break it apart. So next week and in the weeks following, we're going to break it apart, but I'm counting on us having read through it so that we can kind of understand it. Okay, let's talk about the name. What's in a name, indeed. So the name Ecclesiastes, let's go to this first point here. It's from, the title of the book is from the Septuagint, and it's translated in most English translations as teacher or preacher. I don't want to get in the weeds here, but the Septuagint is essentially the Greek translation from the original Hebrew. So you know that the Old Testament, as we call it, the original language is Hebrew. But there's also the Septuagint, which was the early church's translation, and for that matter, our Jewish friends' translation for so many centuries there. So Ecclesiastes as a name, or as a word, is a Greek term. The Hebrew is Koheleth. I think we've got that, yeah, Koheleth. That's Qoheleth. And it's translated best as assembler. So without getting too nuanced here, when we read Ecclesiastes, it's written from the voice of a preacher, I'd rather say a teacher. To me, it is even better to think of it's someone that's bringing everyone together. The Hebrew participle of Koheleth, by the way, is feminine. We often hear it in the masculine because we assume it's Solomon. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the participle that's used with Koheleth is actually feminine. It really doesn't matter the gender. For those of you that are familiar with the book, what age do you think the author of Ecclesiastes is? Just guess. And it will be a guess. Nobody knows, but 40. Now, why do you think 40?
Been around enough to know what's going on, but not old enough to write it off.
That's a pretty good answer. 40. I wasn't expecting that. 40. So been around long enough to know what's going on, but not so old. How'd you finish that? You're okay, not so old that you hate the world. Is that true? When you get old, you hate the world? Some people do. That's exactly right. Remind me your name again. Glenn. Yeah. Glenn helped me get into Second-Ponce, by the way. I was standing outside the door, and I didn't even try it because I see this sign that says the hours are from whatever it is, 8:30 to 4:30. Ring the bell. So I was ringing the bell and waiting, and I hear this voice from behind. Is it locked? And I said, well, I don't know. I didn't try the doorknob, and I opened the door, and it's, well, how about that? It's unlocked there. I thought, this is not speaking well for y'all's Bible teacher. So anyway, thank you, Glenn. And yes, right, you came to this anyway. Yeah, so Glenn thinks the age of the author of Ecclesiastes is 40. Any other thoughts?
I think it's probably around 60, a little older person
Okay.
who had a longer perspective.
Longer perspective. And by the way, in the ancient days, 60 would have been old, right? So you're talking about an old man here. 60 is not so old, is it? Is that correct? Stop looking at your wife there, Doc. That is not cool. Not cool.
Getting younger every day.
That's right, getting younger every day. Any other thoughts? Does anybody think it's written from, like a very young perspective? Probably not, yeah. I think most of us agree that it at least sounds and reads like someone whom, I don't know, sits on a rocking chair at Cracker Barrel wearing a T-shirt that says, been there, done that, Now, I'd like to think it's not an embittered someone, that's just jaded about life. And bitterness can come at any age, young or old. I'd like to think it is someone that has had life's experience, good and bad, has seen successes and failures, right? And has some things that they want to pass along. So, and I know it sounds kind of romantic, but think of the grandparent that just wants a moment of your time and to kind of talk about some things. Had a student, and I'll keep the details somewhat vague, but basically got handed down his first failure. I don't mean grade-wise, I mean job-wise. And he's literally sitting in my office, and even though I'm not a pastor anymore, Doc, he needed a pastor, so he's sitting there falling apart in my office. And I said to him, let's give him a name. I said to him, Jim, I know you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you, but this failure is probably going to be a gift. But you're hurting, and and I want to dial into that, but I want you to trust me. You may have been given a gift, and actually I know he's been given a gift, but you don't see that when you're young. I've got a laundry list of failures. Nowadays I'm just used to it. I'm coming to expect my failures, and that's the difference. You get old enough, you realize, okay, I don't have all the answers. So Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, he is the assembler, the guy or the gal that brings everybody together. And I got some things to share, not out of arrogance, but out of life's experience. I can't remember if I've got another bullet there. Yeah. So in many of your translations, it may even go so far as to describe the author as Solomon or a king or something like that, right? But in the text itself, it never says Solomon. Now, I know if you're a careful reader of that, it says the words of the teacher, that is Koheleth, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So factually or historically, that sounds like Solomon to me. But really, that's an open-ended phrase that can actually refer to, well, any descendant of the royal legacy. We hear it as Ancestry.com. That's not what this is. It's not trying to tell us, here's the genealogy, but rather it's just simply giving us figurative language to say a descendant of Israel, a teacher of Israel. So we can tell he's a religious leader, an assembler of people in the presence of God, and so forth. Let's look now at the date and the historical setting here. So let's get the first bullet in. Many scholars, and these dates may not mean as much to, put it about 330 BCE or to 200 BCE. That's to really tell you it's not a very Old Testament book. So it comes at a period in Israel's life that was probably post-exilic. Now again, that language just simply means, thank you, y'all are anticipating now. That simply means that Israel, and this goes back to your comment, so Israel has not only lived through enslavement and liberation, but they've also lived with exile. And not just once, but twice. So you have these exiles where the Babylonians come in, and they literally vanquish the people. They take out the brightest and best and disperse them into the conquering empire. And this happens once again from the Babylonians to the Persians. And then now they're kind of allowed to go back to their homeland. And we're talking about a stretch of hundreds of years. Our nation is just over 200 years old. We don't understand old. So we're talking about hundreds of years. So it's in the DNA of the people to say, we're home, we're exiled. We're home, we're exiled. We're lamenting, we have hope, we have joy, we have sorrow. It's in the people's DNA to understand that life is always filled with these kind of tensions. And brothers and sisters, every one of us in this room knows that that's true in the individual life. We have joy, we have sorrow, we have success, we have failure. We have times when our faith will move mountains, and then we wonder, I don't know if I should even go to church today because I don't know what I believe. Now, you don't have to answer that, but I've been a pastor long enough, I've been a human being long enough to know this is true. Ecclesiastes gives us the language. It gives us the words. It gives us that grounded optimism that we can keep working at this life, looking for meaning, looking for purpose, looking for hope. So, I think I have one more bullet on that maybe. Yeah, it's part of the wisdom literature collection. And so by that it's included with Proverbs and Job. And wisdom literature is not simply a how-to guide of being wise, but rather giving us the breadth of that. Let me read to you a line from Eugene Peterson in his book, Five Smooth Stones, that scholarship suggests that it was probably during a time of relative peace with moderate prosperity and where, and here I quote, religion, unaggravated by serious conflict, goes to seed. So Peterson's take on this, and he's not an Old Testament scholar, but he is a scholar of some right, was a scholar of some right, translator of what's called the Message. I mean, if you probably have looked at that as inspirational literature. But Peterson's take on this is a time when the church is kind of relaxed, and so the danger of being relaxed is that you become you live in lethargy. Now I'm sitting here trying to think. This used to work a few years ago, but COVID has kind of destroyed illusions that everything is all and well, right? And not just COVID, but world events. All of us have dealt with disruption on a global scale, and it just keeps disrupting, doesn't it? It just keeps disrupting. So maybe Ecclesiastes has a lot more to say than we intended. And maybe it has a few things to say to Second-Ponce as a church about what does this mean for us post-exilic, post-pandemic, post-denominational, post-church, post-Christendom. Maybe it's more relevant than we're willing to give it credit for. Okay, so we'll close with what I think is the fun part, and that is to look at some key words and phrases. So let's go to this next one here. So I'm going to toss to you a handful of words. If you're taking notes, that's certainly fine. Jot them down. But we'll do some refreshers in the weeks ahead here. So one word we're going to get well acquainted with: vanity. Vanity. It's mentioned 38 times in Ecclesiastes. So it's an important word to Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, as we read earlier. All is vanity. Now, it simply means breath or vapor. The implication is it's empty, it's absurd, it's like the wind. We just can't grab it, can't contain it, can't control it, can't domesticate it. Everything is vain. It comes, it goes. You're going to hear this over and over again. Next phrase, chasing after the wind. Look at if you look at verse 14, I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is vanity and a chasing after the wind. That can be translated literally from the Hebrew as a feeding the wind. Now that's why I like the Hebrew language anyway, because it's so poetic. It's just filled with possibilities. Feeding the wind. How do you feed the wind? You can't feed the wind. That's impossible. In fact, it doesn't make sense. What do you mean by feeding the wind? So it's just that. It seems like everything we do, well, what does it matter? Which is a good thing to contemplate. I remember, so Doc had mentioned I was pastor at First Augusta. And after 10 years there and after 27 years of being a pastor, I made a very intentional decision for multiple reasons that my next move was not going to be a pastorate. So I initially went to a nonprofit organization and worked with them for about a year before coming on board at Mercer. But I remember talking with a friend, a mutual friend to Doc and to me. I was talking to this friend shortly after I left First Baptist Augusta, and here's a shocking thing that preachers discover when they leave the church. They get along without us. How could y'all dare live without? Doc, I got news for you. Go away on sabbatical. They're going to do okay. They are. I mean, and you want them to do okay. But there is a little bit of our ego that's a bit tweaked. And I don't want to speak for Doc, but for me it was like, I was kind of having one of those existential crises. Did it matter that I was at Augusta for 10 years? Did I make a difference there? I mean, they seem to be just going along just fine. And the truth is, the longer I've been gone now 6 years, and I was loved there, I'm still loved there, and you see little Facebook comments here and there, but the truth is, the longer I'm gone, the longer I become just that, a memory. And then in time, not even that. And if you think it's bad in the pastorate, think about theological education, Doc, where your cycle of students is about every 3 years. Doc could go on campus now, and outside of staff and faculty, they don't know you. Doesn't matter that you were there 18 years. It's okay. It's okay. But it can feel like a chasing after the wind. That's where I'm going with all that. All right, the next word, toil. Chapter 2, verse 18, I hated all my toil in which I had toiled under the sun. You're going to hear that word toil often, and it's mentioned 25 times, and guess what? It's translated appropriately. It accents suffering and pain and hard labor. All right, for all of you career types, I don't care how much joy and fulfillment you found in your calling. There are days when it's toilsome. I'm not going to speak for Doc, I'm going to speak for me. I love being a pastor. I'm so grateful. One of the joys that I know I will bring to the grave is that I was allowed the privilege of doing just this, being in churches and being with people. Doc, I know that's going to be true for you, but I'm going to only speak from my experience. But there are days in being a pastor when it not only is it work, it's toilsome. Not y'all. I know it is a cakewalk every day at Second-Ponce. I never could be your pastor. I don't know what happened. You know, y'all needed better people, so you called Doc here. But there are days that even the best of the work felt like it was a toil. And I think I can speak for the rest of you in saying, yeah, that's life. It's work. By the way, I grew up on a dairy farm. I do know what work looks like, and it can feel pretty tough. All right, next keywords, wisdom and mind. I'm putting those two together, but you'll find each of these words used interchangeably throughout Ecclesiastes. I applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom. So it refers to the inner person, the heart, the mind. So it's not just cognition. Wisdom's mentioned 26 times. Mind is mentioned 10 times. It's not simply talking about intellectualism there, but it's talking about something kind of deep within the personhood of someone. Next one, under the sun, verse 3 of chapter 1. What do people gain from all of the toil at which they toil under the sun? That's mentioned 29 times. Now that's a lot in a short book, a relatively short book. Under the sun. Finally, fate. 7 of the 10 biblical references of fate occur in Ecclesiastes. I want to say that again. Out of the 10 references of fate in all of the Old Testament, 7 of them are in Ecclesiastes. We're going to get to the theological implications of that in due time there. But fate here is not about mere chance or random event. For the teacher, fate is fact. It is what it is, as my grandma would say. But Ecclesiastes will use the language of fate. All right, just want to pause there and get your comments or observations or thoughts or hopes or what you desire that we reconcile in the weeks ahead. Okay, so what I want you to do, to repeat, is I want you to read through Ecclesiastes. You got a week to do it. My preference would be maybe during your quiet time, just sit down and say, okay, I'm going to read through this book. First reading, I'd like you to put your pen down. Just read it. Let it be what it is. The ancients didn't read with a quill in hand. They heard it. So read it, let it be. And then be the good student and desire to say, okay, now I want to read it, and maybe I'm going to circle that word. I'm going to write this line down. I'm going to talk to Greg about this the next time we gather together on a Wednesday night, so to kind of take it apart. I didn't mention this earlier, but I want to mention it before we close. Another way I'd like you to read it during this study is to find an audio of it. So you can do that. It's free. You can Google this and find an audio reading. You may have a Bible CD set. I've got a dramatic reading that I love to go to just so I can hear a different way this can be heard. Because in its original idea, it was a book to be heard, not read and studied, but a book to hear and to learn from. That's all I got for tonight. Anything else? All right, guys, it's been a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to the weeks ahead. Doc, back to you.